Welcome to the Culture Stew podcast. I'm Maria Morukian.
And I'm Roger Moreano.
In every episode, we will meet with practitioners, authors, and all around fascinating people who share their wisdom and insights on all things related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. Hey, Roger.
Maria, I have to tell you, my head and my mind is taking me back to those days in high school as an athlete.
Yes.
When I was either up at the plate with runners on base or I had a chance to get into a game in basketball, and kind of interspersed with the excitement I felt about being in that moment, I immediately had that excitement replaced with a flood of negative self-talk and just the what's going to go wrong if I don't do this? If I don't get a hit here, will I play again? Like if I don't make this shot, right? And then the last thing on my mind was really, how can I be there for my teammates? What can I do? The things I thought I learned about being a good teammate. And I got so flooded with thoughts of failure and what I might be doing to myself, right? And I think trying to find a place of calm and peace within me was the last thing I was able to tap into. And I think the conversation we just had is one I wish I had had when I was 16.
Ooh, wow. Yeah. So interesting. Yes, I was also flooded with memories from my athletic days. But more so, I think that sense of, definitely that idea of how am I going to screw this up for my teammates, right? And how interesting it is that we all start that negative self-talk so young in our lives.
Oh yeah.
Also, we I recall so clearly these moments of, again, sort of win or lose at the end of a game, at the end of a match, at the end of a race, feeling this sense of camaraderie with not only my own teammates, but also the other players. This idea of, like, especially when the game was really good or when the race was really tough, and just being able to say, holy moly, you made me better. And even if I didn't beat you at this challenge, you made me better. So I guess we should introduce our guest, because we're using all of these sports analogies. Diana Cutaia, who's the president and founder of Coaching Peace, was our guest today. And just, oh, wow, I really, really enjoyed this conversation. So she has been working with Coaching Peace for, gosh, the last, I think, 15 years or so, 20 years, since 2012. But her work really started much earlier than that, when she was working with school districts, with universities, and just as a coach, as an athletics coach. She was also the director of athletics and sports-based initiatives for Wheelock College. She brought a very unique approach there, and I think she began the first ever academic program in sports-based youth development when she was there. So just really interesting how she has consistently in her career found ways to take some of the philosophies and what makes physical sports and athletics so powerful for our own growth and development, and applying it in academic spaces as well as professional spaces.
Yeah. And kind of how we started out, just kind of talking a little bit about our own memories of our athletic days. I think Diana's work is really important in identifying the patterns that exist within systems, within organizations, within communities, that maybe help exacerbate these kinds of thinking that take place, right? The kind of self-limiting moments that happen as teams work together, or as they engage in the actual product that they're delivering or what they're actually participating in. And so I was really grateful to hear her talk a lot about the important aspects of identifying what's at the root of what's prohibiting us from being our best selves, what's at the root of really prohibiting more inclusion and more opportunity for folks to really connect with one another. And what can we do to recognize potential harm that happened along the way
Yeah.
to folks so that we can really repair that and do it in a way that's genuine and lasting in order to really get communities and individuals to a better place to grow, right? We tend to stay away from discomfort and friction because it just doesn't feel good. But I think Diana really spoke to also the importance of really embracing those types of opportunities and moments in order to really understand that that's how we get to peace, is really facing the challenge, facing the monster in front of us, right? And taking it on, working through it, and communicating honestly, and then getting out to a place where you find finally that peace that allows us to be fully who we can be.
Yeah. And I don't want to misquote her here, but one of the things that I found really profound that she shared was just even how we define this kind of notion of this concept of peace, right? That peace is not the absence of violence, it is the presence of humanness, right? And I think
Right.
that is at the core of so much of the work that we do, whether we call it diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, social justice, or just humanization. It is the endless uh, journey, the endless sort of uh, desire to make ourselves and one another, to lift ourselves and one another up, right? The other thing I thought was really great in Diana's discussion around how she works with organizations and leaders was the notion that rather than focusing on changing the quote unquote outcomes, uh, and getting kind of caught up in the endless, conversations around the bottom line, rather than that, focusing on, hey, there's another way, there's another way for us to get to the outcomes that we want that actually is going to be better for us and others. And I thought, it's just such a subtle shift in the language, but a really
Right.
powerful one. So how can we look at that other way that may at the beginning be uncomfortable and hard and take more time, but ultimately gets us even better outcomes than what we wanted before?
Yeah, like learning how to juggle, you know.
Like learning
Eh,
how to juggle. And yeah, she definitely she threw that down. So now I've got to learn, I've got to find a way to meet up with Diana so she can teach me how to juggle.
yes, we're looking forward to a future Instagram post, a reel of you
Definitely.
juggling.
Oh gosh, a real, definitely. Okay, I will make it happen. Um, Listeners, thank you so much for tuning in, and we hope you enjoy our conversation with Diana Cutaia. Welcome to Culture Stew, Diana.
I'm so excited to be here. Thanks for having me on.
We have many questions for you. I can't wait to dig in. So first one is we want to hear a little bit about your backstory. So particularly when you think about your developmental years, what were some of the messages that you received early in life that have really shaped who you are, how you identify, how you live your life?
Oh, wow. There's so many different messages that I got growing up from my family, as well as my culture, as well as where I grew up around it. And I think, uh, you know, whether or not these are the direct messages, the messages that I got were that it was really important for me to pay attention to what was happening around me and to be constantly aware of what that was. I'm a middle child, so I'm always kind of scanning and figuring out like what's going on in the world. Am I safe? Is this, I grew up with a fair amount of trauma.
Mm.
And in that kind of environment, I was always figuring out, watching and seeing what was happening. It turned into what was kind of a coping skill to keep me safe, turned into a skill that actually helped me become better at the work that I do, because I am constantly kind of being aware and seeing the little things that others might not see. Especially when we're in group settings and things like that. But I was always kind of fascinated with figuring out how people connect with each other and the reasons why they disconnect with each other.
Mhm.
You know, being that middle child in some ways was like, how do I connect people all the time? Like, how do I keep people happy? And to some extent, it's still what I'm doing is like, how do I create more love and generosity and kindness in the world? So I think those were some of the messages that I got really early on. I think I got very clear messages around how I was supposed to behave and act, as far as my own gender. So what that
Mhm.
looked like, how I was supposed to perform my gender as being a cisgender woman. There were certain expectations, and I would fall outside of them a lot. I used to hate the term, I still hate the term tomboy, because I feel like I just defined what being a girl was. It was my way of being a girl, and that's what I wanted to be. But spent a lot of years being told, no, 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 don't act like that, don't dress like that, don't talk like that, don't do that, because this is the very narrow kind of idea of what who you're supposed to be. And I didn't want that, but I wasn't a rebel. I wasn't like, yeah, I'm going against the, everybody, because I was, again, like, also very much like, I need to do whatever I can to kind of keep myself safe and not. So I kind of pushed the edges where I could, in a way that I could. Um, but yeah, it's a long answer to your question.
I think one thing that stood out to me is just your comment about, what is, do you have to be a rebel, or what does it mean to be a rebel?
Mm.
And you know and just doing it your own way, right? And I'm curious as to how these dynamics help shape, what you chose to do with your life, because I think nowadays one can probably argue that advocating for peace and advocating to coach peace, or to advocate for more respectful communities, is actually being a rebel, seeing
Mm.
what we're seeing in our society today, right?
Yeah,
So what
yeah.
would you say that, and I suspect I know the answer to this, but would you say that the environment you grew up in and kind of how you grew up helped shape what you decided to do with your life?
I think to some extent it did, for
Mm-hmm.
sure. I think, I married in coaching peace, which was the title of my master's thesis. I never thought I would really do anything with it, but in that, I married two things that were really important to me: creating more peaceful communities, societies, environments, conditions, all of those things, as well as coaching. And when I first started coaching peace, it was really around like this idea of like sport. That was it. Like, and to go back to your question, when I was growing up, sport was the thing that gave me the most joy, gave me the most confidence, made me feel competent, gave me community. I'm still friends with many of the coaches that I had growing up. I turned 50 this year. So, I have really long relationships of folks who showed me what a positive, caring adult looks like. I got tremendous role models in that. So I always knew that I wanted to coach. I always knew that that was something that was super important to me, because it was something that saved me in many ways and helped define who I was and helped me define who I was. So that was always going to be some part of my life. My friends joke with me often, because I knew what I wanted to do when I was 11. Like, I knew exactly what I wanted to do with the rest of my life. Like, I wanted to be in this environment where I could coach others to reach their potential in some way, whatever that looked like for them. And what a journey that's been in making these just dramatic shifts from what I thought it would be to where I am now. But a amazing, glorious journey.
Tell us a little bit more about coaching peace, and what was not only the impetus, but what is it that coaching peace does, and what's the value that it brings?
Oh, Maria, you're going to ask for an elevator pitch that I'm just terrible at.
I bet.
And I think we're gonna verbally process this. We're gonna go through this whole thing together a little bit. I think that the reason I struggle with like really defining exactly what we do is because it's ever evolving. I'll give you the premise. I'll give you the ideas and kind of how we have constructed this in many ways. Like I said, coaching peace was the title of my master's thesis. It was I was a college athletic director. I was teaching at a college around kind of how we use sport as a tool for positive youth development as well as positive social change. And I remembered back to watching kind of a fifth grade girls basketball game in 2001, just after we had invaded Afghanistan. And I remember thinking how, as a nation, we were so desensitized to being at war, and that it wasn't even like on our minds as much anymore, and that we somehow that had to there were people, U.S. citizens, who were fighting in the armies, who were fighting in our military, who were putting their life on the line every single day. And we were going about life in this normal kind of like, this is just what's going on. And I thought, how did we become this? How did we become a society that we're just like, this is just the norm. This is what happens. And why can't we see something different? Like, what is that? And I remember watching this fifth grade girls basketball game and looking at how embedded war and violence were into sport. And it was in the language that we use: opponent, attack, offense, defense, right? We crush and defeat an opponent. We go into the enemy territory. All of that we were coaching every single day. And I thought, oh, well, can't we coach something different? Like, what if we coach something different? What if we use this amazing, beautiful tool that I have loved my whole life to actually create peace? And, to be fair, it was so rudimentary when I first started. Peace was the absence of violence, right? So it was this very binary, and violence being structural, cultural, direct, whatever it might be. Like we have peace when we don't have violence. And, through this journey, we realize like, no, it can't just be the absence of something, but it has to also be the presence of something. And there has to be conditions and ways of viewing the world and the ways in which we interact with each other, a generosity and empathy, a connection that has to be present in order for us to create this idea of peace. And that was so super important and central to what we do. And, it seems like a monumental task, and to some extent it is. So when, again, back to your question of like, what does coaching peace do? Well, we find all the ways that we can build that and embed that into organizations, athletic programs, teams, anywhere there's a group of people who want to come together and say, can we do this differently? Because the way we've been doing it doesn't serve everyone and doesn't create opportunities for us to truly feel that sense of unconditional safety, which is really what peace is, which is what I wanted when I was growing up. What does it feel like to have that space of unconditional safety? And that's all, so that's what we do. So if anybody wants to figure out, how to do that within, like, we figured out in many ways how to do that within any group. It doesn't matter what you're doing in the group.
That's so profound to me. I'd never really put that together in terms of that notion of sort of violence versus peace in our athletics, in our competition. And I think back to my favorite moments when I was younger, and I did a number of different athletics, and my favorite moments were not the parts where we were at war with each other, right? It was that sense of when the competition also included an honoring and a camaraderie, right? And at the end, win or lose, we all shook hands, good game. And there was this sense of like, let's go celebrate together. It's not about feeling that sense of we lost. It was more so, what were we able to accomplish together while we were in this competition? And I never thought about that from that sense of, of war and violence at a more systemic level. That's really profound.
oftentimes when I tell people that, they're like, well, competition's good and we should, competition is important and all of this. And I
Yeah.
always say, like, we're not trying to eliminate
Right.
competition,
Right.
right? We're trying to reframe the point of view that we have in it so that when we think about competition, I love to compete. I
Mm-hmm.
absolutely love it. Right. And there are moments when I have competed and I've lost that I feel, like that has been really because I put so much effort and energy
Mm-hmm.
into it
Right.
that it matters. Right. That's okay. But we have moved away from understanding competition in this, like, that it could be a collaboration, and
Mm.
that, just as you said, like, what a glorious thing when we both try really hard. We're both like really bringing our best, and at the end one comes out a little bit better than the other, but I still want to thank you for that. I still want to be able
Yeah.
to say, like, that was incredible, thank you for coming, bringing your best, and like, you pushed me to be my best, and what a great
Yeah.
opportunity. We've completely eliminated the process in all of that. And we have so focused on the outcome that we're losing all of these other things in
Mm.
between. We do it in business all the time too. We're so focused on the outcome that we forget we're losing people and we're
Yeah.
losing culture and we're impacting culture because as long as the outcome is where we want it to be, then it doesn't matter anything else. And what we, fail to realize is that eventually that system can't sustain itself. Eventually, you will find that, like, there just won't be people who will come in, right? Or the impact that you've had will be on a community, a society, an economy is so big that it's hard to recover from that. How do we stop that?
Well, I so much resonates with me as well, Maria. Like you, I was an athlete as well, and I think so much goes through your head because I think there are so many schools of thought in terms of win at all costs and competition and being a negative thing. And I agree with you, Diana. I think that competition does have the potential to bring the best out in us, right? But there are certain juxtapositions that are happening at play that I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that I struggle with, right? Because and I know athletes that I connect with today struggle with as well, and that is that it's getting them to understand that the effort you put in, and yes, you want to win the game and all that, is going to involve a lot of thought processes that are happening in the middle of that competition, right? And I think being peace or coaching peace has such a strong resonance to folks who maybe in the middle of competition are kind of violent with themselves and their own thoughts or their own worst critic, right? Because in the middle of it, they are processing thoughts that really are defeating in so many ways and really self-inflicting wounds, right? In the middle of I'm not good enough, I'm going to make a mistake, all the negative self-talk that happens in the middle of trying to be your best, right? So there are some aspect about embracing calmness, embracing the moment and being in the moment so that you can perform at your best and not have those thoughts infiltrate. So I think that's one aspect I'm thinking about in terms of how peace plays a role. The other aspect I'm thinking about is that if we're using sports as an example, and you can use other areas as examples as well, if the nature of the sport itself is violent, right? How do you
Mm-hmm.
communicate, this sense of peace and seeing the other with respect and dignity if the nature of my sport is to tackle you and prohibit you from moving forward, right? So I think those are all thoughts that run through my head. And I know there are good examples of that out there, but I'm curious to hear your thoughts on how you help folks go through some of those dynamics that are at play.
Yeah, two really important things that are like central to kind of what the work that we do, every single day. I once worked with a college, D1 college program. Um, they were kind of in the middle of the season. They were struggling a little bit. They were trying to figure out, they had lost some games that they shouldn't have lost. And I said, what is, I asked everybody to just sit back and think silently in your head. I want you to play out the things you say to yourself. Like, just play it out. I don't care. You could be, if you're screaming at yourself in your head, if you're cursing at yourself, if you're saying the most awful things, doesn't matter, saying the best things, whatever. I want you to just play it in your head right now. And everybody kind of laughed and they're like, oh, I couldn't say that out loud. Like, I couldn't, like that. And I said, oh, well, now I actually want you to turn to your teammate next to you And I want you to say the exact same thing that you just said in your head to them. And no one would do it. And no one would do it because they were like, that's awful. Even if I'm joking, I can't do that. And I was like, that's exactly the thing that we need to, like, if you think about it, you think you're motivating yourself in that moment because that's what you've been conditioned to believe, that that's motivation in some way. And it's not, because it just tears you down. It just makes you feel awful. Or you fight with yourself. You're like, I'm going to fight with that person that's so mean to me. And you externalize who you really are in a way that's not helpful, that we're not creating a better person in that space, right? What are the things I say to myself that actually motivate me to move? You know, we did a lot of work about 15, 20 years ago around eliminating, kind of like reducing violence in football. It was a project that had been funded by the NFL Foundation, and there were, you know, big talk about concussions. How do we create that? Yes, I'm going to give you a yes and answer to that question. Yes, there are sports that are wildly violent. And when I say violent, it means that we create an environment where we want to do damage to another person, right? Like we're trying to, you know, like we hype up athletes to be like, go after them and hit them hard. Like that's the kind of environment that we create. That is violence. Contact is not violence. And if we teach people to actually engage in contact in a way that, like, I'm not trying to hurt you. I'm trying to actually just create a strategy or move you in a way that does that. And I'm going to minimize the amount of contact I make with you. And the way I do that so that I keep you healthy and I keep me healthy and safe, right? That can be a part of sport. We don't, because we have this like hyper like aggressive attitude around sport that is really, like, if we're going to go into it, is tied into this idea of masculinity and what it is and how we kind of perpetuate it and all of those other things. That's for a whole other show. But like, there is this idea that we can't do the same. I can have physical contact with someone and not hurt them or not want to hurt them at all. But we do embed violence in games and in sport every single day. And we're so unwilling to really take a look at that. Like, even when I say that to folks who are, I feel like are in the camp with me, you know, around it, they're like, that's a lot. Let's not, you know, sport is this protected thing over here. Let's not, you know, go too hard into it. But that's the thing. Like, we got to say the things in order to change the things. And that's the thing that we have to change in sport, is we have to be more creative. We have to coach better in some ways. It's a game, and we forget that it's a game. And some people make a lot of money from that game. Absolutely. Right. But it's also a game.
It makes me think, Roger, you and I talk about this a lot, just sort of this idea of status quo bias, right? And that we're not always aware of how we might be perpetuating the same structures and systems that we say we are against, because it's so hard. And we're just, you know, it's that sense of, oh, to your point, you know, it's a little too far. We don't want to lose what makes the game, right? And it's like, but
right.
How are we defining the game? And, you know, I think there's so many connections between sports and athletics, and also just organizational environments. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit, Diana, about some of the work that you're doing within organizations around strategy and culture change. And what does this look like, this approach to shifting from violence to contact, for example, right? Or moving from the sense of not losing competition, but bringing more of a growth mindset. How do you transfer that to the work that you do with organizations?
Yeah, I mean, you know, we have one model of leadership that we really have perpetuated since the dawn of time. And that kind of like top down, I'm in charge, I have the knowledge, you listen to me type of thing. We nuance it every once in a while, but we have one mode of leadership, and that's what we're kind of super hyper focused on. And we try to give people different ways of showing what leadership is about and how we can do things, right? So to your point around contact and violence, it's the same thing around, reaching outcomes. So oftentimes we'll say, well, we got to push people really hard, and we got to, we can't cater to everybody's whims because we got to get the bottom line, and we just show them a different way. Like, hey, did you know that if you also do it this way, you also can reach your outcomes if you want, right? Sometimes it's not that cut and dry, right? Like, I'll give you an example. We often say, can you make the case for, like, the business case for equity? I hate that question.
I've never heard that before.
I will never, right? And I will always say, it is not our job to make a business case for humanity, and for treating people as human beings. That's not our job. That's not what we're going to do. We are going to create an environment where you still will find success in that, absolutely. But we're not going to justify treating people like human beings by saying, and you'll also make a lot of money in doing that, right? So we say, like, you can achieve the things you want to achieve. You can get to the goals that you want to get to. You can do it differently. It's no different than me telling a coach, right? If you want to motivate your athletes to do something, you could threaten them with, running. Like, if you don't do this, run 25 laps. They'll probably do what you want them to do out of fear. Or you can do it differently, and you can actually inspire and be creative and get to know them and understand them. Sure, it takes more effort and more engagement, but you'll still yield the same result, but most likely you'll yield a better result even, right? So it's this, like, upfront work that has to happen in order to make the change that you want. We always tell folks that no matter what our organization you're in, whether that's a sport team, a Fortune 500 company, a nonprofit, you're all operating in a system, and that system has a pattern, and that system has been designed to achieve a certain outcome. What we do is try to show you what that pattern is and try to help you shift the system and change the system, because that's the most important thing. It's much easier to make changes in folks when the system, the conditions around them are different, right? Like, I can't respond. If you come into me and I'm like, you know what? I don't like this, this, and this. And you're like, I'm so sorry. Let's talk about that. I can't really continue to yell at you because you've changed the conditions in which we're operating now. You shifted the pattern and the dynamic. So we try to help folks figure out, how do you shift the dynamic? How do you shift the pattern in what you're doing? But we first have to tell them what the pattern is. We have to show them what they're doing, and tell them it's okay. There's a different way, and there's always a different way. And that's the thing that I think is the most important thing that we do, is we show people that there's a better way. There's a different way to do things.
Well, and that could be scary for a lot of folks, right? With it, whether you talk about individuals or organizations. And I think as you help folks define the patterns and define how we got to where we're at today, it's also the recognition that those patterns probably caused some harm along the way for some folks, and perhaps closed doors. Yeah. And so what I think I really appreciate about what you're doing with Coaching Peace is that you're doing the work in a way that's emphasizing equity, that's emphasizing belonging, but it's also emphasizing safety, psychological safety in particular. And what I love most is repairing of harm. And I'm really curious if you could talk a little bit more about how you go about doing that, because I think that's obviously emphasizing the core beliefs you have in your organization, but it's also letting folks know that we can choose the values by which we live, right? And we can choose to recognize what has been, recognize who it impacted, and then really make intentional efforts to move to a better place while taking care of those who have been harmed along the way. So how do you go about doing that?
Yeah, I mean, I wish there was like a simple, quick answer around it. But I will tell you that the number one thing that we do, that we start with, and that if you do nothing else, to some extent, although I hope you do more than this, is acknowledgement, right? Is we acknowledge the harm. We actually say it out loud. We acknowledge it, we bring it to this ever-present space around it. And that is the only place you can start to repair something. It's not where you should end, right? It's not like we're like, I just did a really, awful thing to you. All right, do you want to go now? Are we done? And you're like, and what's the next thing, right? And we often, when we think about repairing harm, especially with others, I know we do this in probably our relationships or with other people, but organizationally, we do this a lot, is we never ask the people who are harmed what they need. So we never actually say like, hey, how might we repair this harm? What are some of the things that we need? Not to say that it's their responsibility by any means to figure out and to tell us, well, you need to do this, this, and this. But we also then, what we do is we say, well, we're going to repair this harm. So we're going to do this, this, and this. And we're like, aren't you grateful now that we've repaired this harm because we've done this, this, and this for you? And you're like, that's great. I didn't need any of that. I just needed this, but you never asked me, or you never did your research or homework to actually figure that out. And that's the thing, is that, to the point earlier that I was making around like how we motivate, how we create, it takes more effort at times to do the right thing. That doesn't mean we shouldn't do the right thing, right? And that's the hardest thing, is how do we get people to recognize that, like, doing the right thing means I got to think differently. I got to do some homework. I got to actually like pay attention. I have to connect with somebody. I have to really know them. That takes more effort, but it's the right thing to do. And how do we do that? So that idea of repairing harm, right? You've got that acknowledgement. You've got like, what are the things we're doing in the moment to do that? And then going back to that idea of the system, fix the actual thing that created that harm in the process, right? So it's the idea that like, I have to fix the system to make sure that that doesn't happen again. I can't just keep saying sorry, right? I have to actually change what happened. And that too is challenging because people feel threatened by that in some way. Like, oh, well, can't we just acknowledge this and like fix this for this one person, and then this one person feels better? And then, but do we really have to change the whole system? Because the system benefits me and I work really well in this system. So can we not change that? And you're like, no, we have to change it. Right. And our challenge is to make sure that everyone reaches their potential in that process. Right. We're not trying to take those who have been most marginalized, disadvantaged, oppressed, right, and swap places. We're raising all boats. How do we do that? And sometimes that does mean that there's a balance shift that has to happen initially, that we have to be okay with. But yeah, it's not, when we think about that idea of repairing harm and working, it's not easy work by any means. And we try to be like, we talk about ourselves as being co-creators and partners. Like we want to figure this out with you. We're going to be in this journey with you. We don't do any real one and dones with anybody. We're not going in, we're not doing a training. I mean, don't tell people, but trainings don't generally work. Right?
Right.
I mean, and the reason they don't work is because we do nothing after that.
Yeah.
Think about it like this. If you had a paramedic, okay, who came in for a one-day training, and then you were like, good luck, go save a life. Like they wouldn't be trained, they'd be informed, right? If we're not assessing, evaluating, coaching, mentoring, like all in that kind of process, like, there has to be a larger thing. And we've been so lucky that so many of our clients have let us be long-term partners with them to really make cultural shifts, because it's like turning a tanker. It's like, it's a slow, tiny process in order to do that.
Diana, I want to ask you some questions about what you just mentioned in terms of some of the examples of success stories of that long-term change. But I first wanted to acknowledge a couple of things that you said that are really important. I hope our listeners kind of tuned in for that. One is, yes, we often say, even as trainers and facilitators, we know it's probably not good for our bottom line, but like, yeah, training alone, especially to your point, if it's a one-off training, that's just informing people, it's not necessarily going to lead to behavior change or accountability. And in fact, sometimes it backfires.
Right.
And
right.
And the other piece that I thought was really powerful was this notion of work avoidance that I think a lot of times happens when we maybe acknowledge the harm partially or one time, but don't actually, again, engage in the accountability work, the advocacy work of changing the systems, of really listening to the messages that are coming to us from those who have been oppressed, who are saying, this is what I need. Are you listening? Right. And I've seen that so much with people who, especially in the last few years, who I think do truly genuinely want to be allies, want to be agents of change. And yet, when they are faced with that moment of truly having to acknowledge how they have perpetuated harm, there's a lot of like, I'm just going to pick up my toys and go home. How can you not appreciate me? I am an ally. I have done all of these things. And it's like, what, you want a cookie like that? No, there's there's a lot more you need to do. You're just getting started. Are you willing to actually be in the work with us? And I think that is a big shift that a lot of leaders and people in positions of societal power need to accept, that the saying I'm sorry or reading a book is the bare minimum, but now the real work begins. So I was just wondering if you could share a little bit, Diana, some of the stories or examples from some of this longer term, longer range work that you're doing with clients. I don't want to call it success, right? Because this is ongoing work, but where have you seen some of those shifts in terms of true structural change, true repairing of harm?
We did a training for a big corporation, and thousands and thousands of employees across the world, and we were talking to them about equity and doing kind of a presentation. And I talked about kind of the myth of the meritocracy, that we don't live in a meritocracy, like we can't, this is not like, and this one gentleman and I kind of went over it really quickly, and he was like, can you go back to that? I don't think I understood what you're saying. And we went back to it, and we went through, and he didn't say anything. He was just like, okay. And we've been working with them for about 16 months now. Every time I talk to him, he's like, my mind is less blown, but still blown, that I see the world completely differently now in everything that I do. I'm looking at the world differently, and I'm understanding equity completely differently, and started reading books on liberation, and like started to like really ask deep, deep questions. And I have 50 stories like that. And I feel like so much of the impact of the work that we do, that the team that works with me does, is we don't even know, because there's so many folks that don't tell us necessarily the impact that we've had in that way. But it's those small things. We had another gentleman that said, it wasn't until we started talking and understanding about how we marginalized women in the workplace that I started to sit back in meetings and listen and be like, oh, wait a second. We really don't pay attention to women when they present an idea. I saw numerous times someone would state the same idea that, a woman in the, meeting stated, and they would accept that idea, but not what she said. He's like, I never saw that before. So like half the things that we try to do is open people's eyes to be like, look, you really have, once we create the spark, then people go down the road to really figure out like, oh, I want to learn more. I want to understand this better. And our job is like, how do we create the spark? What are the things that we do in order to do that? The amount of organizations that we've worked with who have said, wow, we figured out a different way of working that really honors and respects folks in a way that we weren't doing that. The ways in which people will take the information that we have and use it is even better sometimes than we intended for it to be. We might say like, hey, here's a tiny little training that you can do around it. And they're like, we're not going to just do the training. We're also going to create a community that talks about the training. We're going to have more socials that are connected to this training and they'll go down a road that like, we can't even imagine. So I feel like I make 10%, maybe 5% of the change, maybe 1%. And we allow the doors to open so that more change happens. I also recognize like, I'm not trying to romanticize my work by any means, or the work that we do. Like, let's be honest. There are moments I leave and I say, wow, that was like, it's, the most Sisyphean thing in the world. I feel like I just did this great thing. And you just said the exact thing that we've been talking about for 45 days.
Yes.
And it is the persistence and the consistency that I feel like there are days I want, as I'm sure you all as well, that I want to say, give up. And I have a fair amount of privilege to say that I could just be like, okay, I'm going to give up. Right. I recognize
go do something else. Right. Yeah,
exactly. And that, I have to say like, no, it is the consistency every day. I have to continue to show up, even the days I don't want to show up and the days I don't want to do that. There are some days that I love the things I do and the work I do. It's just, and there are some days that I'm exhausted as others. And I think like, how do I consistently show up? And if I consistently show up and can continue with the same message, will there be change? And how will there be change? And in that process too, I'm constantly learning. The work that I did even 2 years ago and the ways in which I talked about things, I'm learning in this process. And I'm doing a lot of listening and trying to figure out like, hey, can I do this differently? Can I do it better? Can we change something? I'll give you a quick kind of just story that always stays with me. There's a woman who works at a nonprofit in Boston who I've known for 25 years. And we use juggling a lot in our workshops to kind of talk about a whole bunch of things. Motivation, the way we manage stress, frustration, all of these types of things.
Do you make your participants juggle?
Yeah.
Oh my
yes.
God.
Yes.
That's awesome.
And we've made it as much, I won't say like fully accessible, but very accessible. We're working on making it kind of fully accessible. But this woman cannot juggle. Like she's been in like the only person I've probably trained.
Same. I cannot juggle.
Maria, we're doing it. We're doing it.
All right, I'm coming for a tutorial.
Please, right? And it is the way I look at this, is it's my responsibility to figure out a new way of teaching her. And like, I'm always thinking, like, she's the one I think about all the time when I'm like, how can we do this differently? What should we do differently? How can we teach differently so that I actually help you understand something better? So that's what I feel like, I guess the thing that drives me the most, that informs the work that I do all the time, is like, I am responsible, as if I'm taking on that role as facilitator, as leader, I am responsible for trying to help you get to success. I'm not wholly responsible for that, but I am responsible. If you're putting in the effort, you're meeting me here, then I have to continue to come up with ways to do that. And that's what I feel like is the work all the time. Like, how do I figure it out? And Maria, now we have to do this. I don't know where we're going to do it, when it's going to happen. It should be live streamed. I don't know.
It should be live streamed. We'll make it a LinkedIn live event of Diana teaching Maria how to juggle, because no one has been able to do it thus far. So
I want to learn how to juggle.
Right?
Roger,
you didn't set it up in a way that you were like, I can't do this. So like, yes, right. I'll teach you. But the challenge now has been laid.
Yes, it has.
The gauntlet has been thrown.
Exactly. Exactly.
Do you also teach people how to ice skate? Because I'd like to learn that too. So if you,
I do not do that. I do not.
Okay.
Roger, I'll teach you how to ice skate.
Yay!
I love this. Look at this. It is like connection, generosity. I love it.
Yes, yes. Well, Diana, this has been really impactful, and I think everything you just said, especially in the last bit here, kind of really spoke to me in terms of the weight that we carry in doing this work, right? And how much it could really impact us. And I'm curious, in the process of doing the work that you're doing with folks, to teach folks how to juggle, to teach folks how to manage, so many complexities. How do you take care of yourself in the process? What are you doing to make sure you're staying above water? I mean, we're living in times when, as we've discussed here, the work can be very rewarding, right? And we really feel good about the work we're doing. And we're also living in a time when the work itself is kind of under attack in many ways, right? There's a lot of, specifically the DEI work that we engage in is, we have folks coming after it. And so that could add weight and stress to us, right? So how do you take care of yourself? What do you do to make sure that the juggling is being done with rhythm and effectiveness, and that you're feeling really good about it?
Yeah, I mean, I have a fair amount of privilege in a lot of ways. And one of that is I run my own business. And that means that I get to dictate the amount of work I take and the ways in which I work. I'm not always good at that. Sometimes I get so excited that I'm like, wait, did I just book the entire month of March and I didn't give myself a day off? Absolutely, right? Like, I do it all the time. I am also of the school of thought that, like, if I don't have to work a day, if there isn't something going on that is pressing me to do something, I'm not working to work. I am not, like, I am going to take that time off. If I have a day where I could just work 3 hours, I'm just going to work 3 hours and do that. And we live in a world so much where it's more. Just do more, just do more. Well, you could be making more money, or you could be doing this. And I fell into that a lot. I was the person that kind of had the philosophy that you get to work before your boss does, and you leave after your boss does. Like, you're there all the time. And I used to put in 15-hour days. And I realized, like, I can't sustain myself in that process. And I do no good. And it leaves me no space to find other joys in my life. I recognize that's a privilege. So I feel like I also try to help organizations figure out how to do that for each other in that space. Like, how do you create space and time for folks? How do you work hard for a couple of hours, get the things you need to get done, and then take that time, in the afternoon off, or take a couple hours off? And it is, I mean, talk about like status quo bias. It's this like capitalist ethic bias of like, but if you have time in a day and you are not working, you are not successful and you're not making money. And if you're not making tons and tons of money, then what are you doing? And that's a thing too, that this generation coming up is like, no, we're not going to live like that. And so you can keep that ethic as long as you want, but your workforce that's coming in right now is going to rail and be like, sorry, that's not the way we're going to operate. So changes have to be made in some ways, for sure. But that's how I take care of myself. I take off whenever I absolutely positively can. Last year I traveled about 65,000 miles by plane. And I was pretty busy, but the times when I wasn't busy, I wasn't doing anything. I mean, I was just doing, I call my garage the play lab, and I just come up with new fun activities sometimes. I just sit and play in the garage.
That's beautiful. Oh, Diana Cutaia, thank you so much for coming on the show. This has been life-giving, and I am going to, well, one, I'm going to take you up on that offer for the juggling lessons, but two,
100%.
to your point on the, you know, the self-care piece, I think that all of us can become, especially when we care so deeply, when we have such deep passion and commitment to the work that we are doing, to the mission of the work that we're doing, we can sometimes really exhaust ourselves, and you know, the mileage becomes a little too much. So I think that's liberatory, right? When we actually say, I am not going to work just for the sake of working today. I'm going to take this time and engage in other things that bring me joy. So
exactly.
right.
Rest is resistance. Was
Yes.
you know.
Yeah. Brilliant. So if people are looking to learn more about you and Coaching Peace, where can they find you, Diana?
Coachingpeace.com. We're in the process of revamping our website a little bit. You can definitely find me on LinkedIn and things like that, for sure. So
awesome. We'll put all of that in the show notes. And thanks to our listeners for tuning in. Diana, thank you so much for joining us.
well, thank you both. And thank you for the work that you're doing every day. I appreciate it so much. And thank you for affording me a little bit of a platform to share some of my ideas as well.
Thank you for listening to Culture Stew. In a world full of podcasts, we are so grateful that you chose to spend time with us today.
Culture Stew is produced by MSM Global Consulting and hosted by me, Maria Morukian.
And me, Roger Moreano.
Are you interested in learning more about Culture Stew and MSM Global Consulting? Sign up for the Culture Stew newsletter at www.msmglobalconsulting.com and send us your stories or your questions at culturestew@msmglobalconsulting.com.
And remember to please give us a 5-star rating and review on your podcast platform.
See you next time.